doing some strange things.
It's not like you're looking for it. Well, we don't need all of it. No, oh, great. Well, that solves all my problems.
Right. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Yes, he's going to be here with Mrs. Baker.
I have a single service working out, so we know how to talk about the other people.
Are you adapting to academia here a little bit? I went to Baker, teaching sociology. That's pretty right there.
No, I've had it for a while, and actually this year, my young daughter's softball team was looking at their
Right down here. I'm sorry that we are late.
No, but are you right? The plane was bumpy and okay. Leon, how are you?
My friends, this is terrible today. Finish it. 2 hours.
No,
I thought I would die.
Finish it.
Or you make it better.
So, your wife has been precious. She has been
Now, given the lateness of the, so then we don't have to worry about the press. Yeah. And walk straight, and then we'll turn to the.
Could you tell us, first of all, why has Netanyahu canceled his visit to the United States?
Oh, he's not cancelled the visit. He will hold a visit later than the date that people thought he would be coming in. There were good reasons for the new Prime Minister of Israel to come and speak to the President, the Secretary of State, the administration, Congress, about American-Israeli relations, the peace process, the need to coordinate policies that has been a hallmark of our relations. And you know, there are no vacuums, and things are happening in the Middle East. And there is an Arab Summit conference that is being convened, and some thought it would be good to hold it earlier rather than later. But Mr. Netanyahu has thought about it, consulted about it, felt that he was not fully prepared for these very important discussions, that he would rather take a few more days and prepare thoroughly for the visit. I took it up today with the Secretary of State, with his team, and in consultation we agreed that this being the case, it would be better to have the visit take place somewhere in the second week of July, I would think. So there's been no cancellation, there's been a postponement mutually agreed to by the incoming Israeli government and by the administration, and it's all natural and in order.
Is he not prepared because Israeli policy is changing?
There definitely will be a certain change or modification of policies. The elections represented the victory of the opposition over the government, and it was an opposition that ran on a platform of a change in the policy. I believe that not every statement made in the election will become a new platform for policy, but definitely there will be changes as compared to the present policies.
Will Mr. Netanyahu be meeting with Mr. Arafat before he meets with Mr. Clinton?
I don't know about such a meeting. I'd be surprised if it takes place, certainly at this timing.
The mayor of Tel Aviv, Ronnie Milo, has said today that he feels that Netanyahu must meet with Mr. Arafat.
Yeah, I spoke about the particular timing. You know, I don't think there is a decision that there will not be a meeting, but I'm not certain that this is an early priority.
Is Mr. Netanyahu worried about the Arab Summit?
I think he and many others are concerned. I would say concerned rather than worried. Not about the very idea that there will be an Arab Summit. I think it's quite natural for Arab states to meet and try to coordinate policies, but because of some of the themes and the tones that we have been hearing. There's been a preparatory meeting in Damascus, and there was some very tough rhetoric in that meeting. There was even a hint of violence or a threat of violence. There has been some violence, unfortunately, in South Lebanon and inside Israel. And it is not the notion of a summit, but the notion of a summit accompanied by threats, intimidation, negative tones, that I think worries not just Mr. Netanyahu, but many Israelis and many others.
Speaking of the violence, is there any, I noticed that the date for the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers, to be out of Hebron has passed. Is there any new date set for them to be out of there?
No, I think this is one of the issues that we will have to sort out with the Palestinians. As we discussed earlier, there will be some changes in policy. I don't think that anyone at this point knows the extent of the changes. I don't think that anything is set in stone. Policies will be determined not just on the basis of Israeli will, but also on the basis of give and take with the Arab parties to the peace process. And I think that there isn't a firm decision on this, but this is an issue that has to be deliberated and decided on.
Mr. Ambassador, this
Yeah.
election indicated there are extremely deep divisions among Israelis over the direction that Israel needs to be going. I mean, the closeness of the election says that. How firm a hold does Mr. Netanyahu have on the direction things are going to go?
He can have a firm hold. Prime Minister Rabin led this remarkable peace process with a very slim majority in parliament. And there's been a constitutional change or reform in Israel. The Prime Minister, once Mr. Netanyahu forms the government, will be a more powerful Prime Minister with added authority. And the slimness of the majority in parliament will be less crucial than it would have been under the older system. At the same time, I think that we Israelis have all learned a lesson from the tensions, divisions, tough rhetoric, and let us unfortunately not forget the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in November. And I think that your question is very well put, that whichever party was to win the election this time would have won it by a very slim majority, and I think would be very well guided by remembering that a very large minority of Israelis think otherwise.
Well, it seems that Mr. Netanyahu, or at least people outside Israel, have observed Mr. Netanyahu already softening and backtracking on some of the things he said to get himself elected. How firmly committed is he to taking Israel in a different direction?
Well, I believe the term "read my lips" was not invented in Israel, and people know that there's always a difference between election rhetoric and the realities of the morning after. At the same time, one should not expect a total reversal or backtracking. There will be some movement to, let's say, to a more centrist position, some accommodation. The extent of it, I think, will depend to a considerable extent on the give and take, verbal and real, that we have with our Arab partners. And the needle will stop at some point that I think is to the left of the election rhetoric, but to the right of the previous policies.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome to Houston.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute at Rice University. It will be my privilege to introduce Secretary Baker, who will then introduce our speaker this evening. This is part of the Shell Lecture Series of the Baker Institute. Our first speaker was Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General of the United Nations. We've had the Foreign Minister of Tunisia, and we are honored to have Ambassador Rabinovich as part of this distinguished series. It's my honor to introduce Secretary Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. And I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say how delighted we are to have Ambassador and Mrs. Rabinovich join us this evening. Their presence really is both a personal pleasure for Susan and me, and it's as well a distinct honor for the Baker Institute. From our inception here just a couple of years ago, this institute has been dedicated to the ideal of bridging the world of action and the world of ideas in ways that advance the cause of international understanding. And in a very real sense, Itamar Rabinovich embodies that ideal. As academician, as peace negotiator, as ambassador, Itamar has made truly vital contributions to the Middle East peace process. And nobody in the United States today, or for that matter, in many countries around the world, can speak more expertly of the complex issues that today surround the search for a just and lasting settlement in the Middle East. And nobody has shown a stronger personal commitment to the cause of peace. I stress the idea of a personal commitment because only that kind of a commitment by all parties of all nationalities can deliver the sort of enduring peace that millions of Arabs and Israelis truly long for and really deserve. No man, of course, symbolized that commitment more than Itzhak Rabin, a leader of vision and courage who sacrificed his life in the cause of peace. Itzhak Rabin was someone that both Itamar Rabinovich and Jim Baker are proud to have called friend. This makes it all the more appropriate that Itamar joins us as we move forward with endowing the Baker Institute Fellow for Peace and Security in honor of Itzhak Rabin. We see this endowed fellowship as a tribute to one of this century's truly great leaders. And we see it as well as our modest contribution to his legacy of peace and security. Like all of you, I look forward to hearing Itamar's thoughts this evening on where the Rabin legacy stands today in the aftermath of the recent elections in Israel. While serious questions have been raised in the wake of these elections, and we can expect at the very least a substantial pause, I think, in negotiations, I personally am convinced that this does not mean we are witnessing the end of the peace process as we've known it. Moreover, I think we should not forget that the situation today is still tremendously better than it was before the Madrid conference, when Arabs and Israelis would not even talk to each other. Itamar Rabinovich, both as scholar and as public servant, did much to bring about this historic change. It is with great respect, my friends, that I call him friend, and it is with great pride that I welcome him to the Baker Institute, to Rice University, and to Houston this evening. Itamar, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, Ms. Baker, Françoise, Ed, our Consul General, Mrs. Ronnie, friends, of course my own wife who has come along on this journey as well. I'm moved by the opportunity to be here as a guest of the Baker Institute and to speak to this particular audience in this specific location about the Arab-Israeli peace process against the background of the formation of the Yitzhak Rabin Chair in this institute. Let me begin with a small personal history that will lead us to the larger and more abstract events. My own participation in the peace process and Israeli diplomacy began one Saturday morning in July 1992, and a couple of weeks after Yitzhak Rabin had formed his government. He invited me home on a Saturday morning and did not have to jeopardize the coalition because we live within walking distance of the Rabin apartment. And we had a talk, and he said, you know, I'm looking for a new chairman for the Israeli delegation to the peace talks with Syria. Now, it was typical of Yitzhak Rabin not to say, you know, I think we can go a long distance in negotiations with Syria, or I think the prospects of negotiations with Syria are much better than people assume. What he said was, you know, Jim Baker was here last trip after he was to Damascus, and we spoke about what he heard in Damascus and what the United States wants to do in this context. I won't go into the details of what he told me, but these were quite startling details, and the message was very clear. And he thought that there was a great prospect of moving forward with Syria, and that he meant to do it, and that his offer of heading the delegation to the peace talk with Syria was not an offer for an honorific position, but an offer for a very serious negotiation. That was his way of saying that he could be the most direct of men, or he could be very subtle in the way he wanted to convey a message. And the report on his conversation with Jim Baker was his way of letting me know that he planned, was meant to go the distance in the negotiations with Syria. And so I gladly accepted, and 2 or 3 days later I had a phone call from a man I had not met before. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Ambassador Georgian, who called me to congratulate me on the appointment, and we had a great talk on the phone and looking to working together, which transpired soon enough. And this was the beginning of a very significant journey in which both Secretary Baker, who soon thereafter moved to the White House, and the Assistant Secretary played a very important role. And I feel that I'm in a way completing a circle or a cycle by coming here. And of course, the notion of endowing a chair after Yitzhak Rabin, who I think rightly was described as one of the great statesmen of the 20th century. The ability to see the big picture, to distinguish between the important and the trifle, to make the right decisions on the basis of these distinctions, and to move large masses of individuals and to move the governmental machinery that had to move were all his, and the peace process would not have taken on from the point of departure without his leadership, and would not have stayed the course without that leadership. And again, let me share with you one anecdote that I think illuminates the way in which Yitzhak Rabin was a leader of men. It was a spring day in Jerusalem. Secretary Christopher was about to come back from Damascus, where he was conducting a very difficult negotiation with President Assad over a small point. And you would not be surprised. And we were waiting in Jerusalem for the secretary and his team, headed by Dennis Ross, to come back and share with us the events of the day in Damascus and to see how we could proceed. The larger context was a long negotiation over the principles that would underlie the security arrangements between Syria and Israel. If you want to have an idea of what negotiation with Syria is like, then the Syrian or President Assad's insistence on the word equality in these principles and the need to find a way around it took about 2 months of these negotiations. That was a particularly sticky point. And so Secretary Christopher and the team came back. They landed at about 10 p.m. I got the first report of what went on in Damascus. There was a problem. I called the Prime Minister, who was busy somewhere, and spoke to him on a mobile phone, and he said, we'll meet in my residence at 11 p.m. It's 11 p.m. So I came to the residence together with his military aide, General Yatom, who is now the head of the Mossad. And we looked at the problem, and then Prime Minister Rabin said, just a minute. In the military annex to the 1974 disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria, the one negotiated by Henry Kissinger, was there not a point about an interim area separating the two countries? Now, I was the Syria expert, and General Yatom was the interim, and we didn't remember. So he said, I'm pretty sure there was one. Let's find out. And so we began a series of phone calls. It was already almost midnight to find a text of the agreement. And we were to have a text at about 1:30 a.m. So we said to the Prime Minister, why don't you go to sleep? And, we'll wait for the text and we'll wake you up. The Prime Minister said, no. He said, you're working on it, I'm working on it. That again was a measure of the man. He wouldn't let us work, he stayed with us. Papers came, and of course he was right. What he thought was there, and the next morning we used it to advantage in the negotiations with Secretary Christopher, moved on, and eventually there was an agreement between Syria and Israel on the principles underlying the security arrangements between the two countries. And only one small instance of the way in which a leader of the country who knew the smallest of detail, but always saw the large picture, was a leader of the men. He was the leader of our peace team, and as a military general, knew that you do not go to sleep when your men are working, and that was an example of the leadership that we all felt. It was a great privilege to have worked closely with him for over 3 years, and that's something that will stay, of course, will stay with us forever. And I think that he will be commemorated at the Baker Institute, but he'll be remembered in many other ways. Now, I mentioned two policymakers, Secretary Baker and Prime Minister Rabin, and I would like to speak about 3 phases for the Arab-Israeli peace process. Each of them has to do with one of them. And this is something I would have said even if this presentation was to be made at the University of California. The fact that it's taken place here at Rice, at the Baker Institute, is incidental, because the first phase, the phase that created, fashioned, formulated the peace process, is of course marked by Secretary Baker as Secretary of State. The Madrid conference, the Madrid framework, the fact that everybody came to Madrid, the fact that Arabs and Israelis began a journey on a road that has so far lasted almost 5 years, was his creation, and he will always deserve credit for this, among other things. Now, you may say, well, what's so special about bringing Arabs and Israelis to talk for 5 years? The answer is that it never happened before. The Arab-Israeli conflict is now almost 50 years old. The Arab-Jewish conflict in the land of Israel is more than a century old. Throughout this period, the 50 years of the full-fledged conflict and over a century of the burgeoning conflict, there never was one sustained effort to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. There were many short-lived efforts. There were some efforts successful, like the Egyptian-Israeli peace, to solve part of the problem. There wasn't a single sustained effort to solve the problem. The first such sustained effort is the Madrid process. And this is the first time and the only time that it has happened in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yasser Arafat is the first Palestinian leader who met with the Israeli leadership, who negotiated with them, who made a deal with them and made it work. It's again extraordinary that in the previous century of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was never a mainstream Palestinian leader who either wanted or could do that. This is the uniqueness of this peace process. And so the first phase was a phase of bringing the parties together, and the orchestration of an effort that would bring both the Likud government of Israel led by Yitzhak Shamir and Hafez al-Assad of Syria, and the Palestinians represented not by the PLO, but by Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza who were not representing the PLO, who only took the orders from the PLO, and to bring the Jordanians and the Lebanese, and to have thought at that time not just about the direct negotiations, but also about the multilateral peace process, was a work of art, and it created a framework that has constituted the Arab-Israeli peace process and has produced later the achievements of the Arab-Israeli peace process. So that is the first phase. Then came the second phase, in which this process began to yield fruits and results. And this is the process that was shaped by Yitzhak Rabin. And of course, he was not alone. He had a partner. Shimon Peres was his foreign minister, and under very sad circumstances succeeded him as prime minister. Many others in the Israeli system, and of course, the American partners who worked with us in the last month of the Bush-Baker administration, and then during the Clinton administration, and the Arab partners who made their own very brave decisions and moved this peace process. But in the summer of 1992, when Rabin became the prime minister, and to the present, this process has unfolded fully in full force and has produced 3 very important achievements. And let me very briefly say something about each of them. First and foremost, the agreement with the Palestinians. Now, this, of course, is the most controversial part of the peace process, and as we all remember, Not too long ago, the Israeli public voted its reservations about it. I'm not saying rejection, I'm saying reservations about the agreement. It has been a controversial issue. It has divided the Israeli public. It has generated heated debates and strong feelings, and subsequently led to the assassination of Rabin. But it was a very important breakthrough, without which other breakthroughs would not have happened, because at the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict lies the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel has no quarrel with Tunisia. Israel has no quarrel with Morocco. Israel has no direct quarrel with Kuwait. They all came to participate in the Arab-Israeli conflict because as Arabs or as Muslims, they were beholden to the Palestinians. They felt that they had to support the Palestinians. And once the Palestinians made a peace with Israel, once they offered us the recognition, a very important part of the Oslo agreements or the Washington signing event was the mutual recognition. We recognize the PLO as the legitimate national movement of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians recognize Israel not just as a state, but as a legitimate Jewish state in the Middle East. It's something that had been denied to us by the Palestinians for more than a century. By giving it to us, they opened the door wide for other Arabs to walk through that door. Now we have to remember, the agreement with the Palestinians is not a final agreement. This was an agreement that envisaged 3 phases. 2 of them have happened. The third, in many ways the most important, has yet to happen. Final status negotiations. And these final status issues are very controversial. We and the Palestinians do not see eye to eye. The new Israeli government is even a greater reservations, and the gap between the new government's view of these final status issues and the Palestinians' view of these issues is wider than it was under the previous government. So this is not a foregone conclusion that these negotiations will succeed, and there are 3 years in which they ought to be conducted. But it's a framework agreement. It set the framework for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. It opened the door for agreements between Israel and other parts of the Arab world, and it created a basis for Palestinian self-rule. And the Palestinians, most of the Palestinians, of course in Gaza and in the West Bank, are now administered, governed on a daily basis, not as a state, not as a full-fledged entity, but on a daily basis are administered and governed by other Palestinians, which even many critics on the Israeli side of the spectrum see as a very positive development, because not too many Israelis have an appetite for governing or administering the life of the Palestinians. Now, the second achievement that flew almost directly out of this was the full-fledged peace with Jordan. Jordan signed with us a full-fledged peace treaty and joined Egypt in being the second Arab state to have such full-fledged peace with Israel. But Jordan went beyond Egypt, because Jordan made an early decision to go not just for a formal peace, but for a warm peace, for a warm, genuine relationship between the 2 states. Jordan is also a state that has with us a very long border, and we live in proximity to the Jordanians. We are separated by Egypt, from Egypt by a desert. From a security point of view, it's a great asset. In terms of daily life, it creates a natural buffer between Israelis and Egyptians, and both societies have so far chosen to live separately and feel quite well about it. With Jordan, the proximity is different, and the relationship is going to be of a different nature. And thirdly, a great deal of normalization between Israel and the rest of the Arab world. We don't have full-fledged diplomatic relations, but we now have diplomatic relations of some sort with several other Arab states, with Morocco and Tunisia in North Africa, with Oman and Qatar in the Gulf, and practical relations with many other Arab states. 2 economic conferences have now taken place in the Middle East, in which the Arab states, all of them, or practically all of them, including Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, have participated, discussed joint economic future of the Middle East. The establishment of a Middle East bank, a Middle East Development Bank, in which Israelis and Arabs will participate, has been agreed upon. These and other developments that 4 or 5 years ago would have seemed like a figment of one's imagination are now a reality, a fragile reality, but a reality. And Israelis have the sense that they can be part of the Middle East, that it is not forever that Israel will have to be or to feel like an alien element in a sea of Arabs, that it could actually be part of the region. It will have then varying relationships with varying Arab states. We may always have a cool relationship with Egypt, where we have a geopolitical competition. We are more likely to have a warm relationship with Jordan. With Syria, even at the point when we sign peace, warm peace will be slow in coming. But with Lebanon, a very different relationship can develop. There are more than 20 Arab states. We do not expect to have a uniform relationship with all of them, but we have, as a result of these achievements, an inkling of what a normal relationship with our neighbors could look like. Now, these are the three positive, very important developments or accomplishments of the peace process. But, of course, it was not free of problems. One is that there have been enemies to this peace process. Of course, critics and opponents on both sides, but one distinct enemy, Iran, that has seen this as dangerous to itself. Iran has its own vision of what the Middle East should look like, and the idea of a peaceful Middle East where economic relations, development are the governing issues, where a group of Middle Eastern states in close alliance with the United States dominate the politics of the region, where Syria is being drawn away from Iran to be part of that group, is not the Iranian view of what the Middle East should look like. And therefore, Iran has done almost everything that it could in order to torpedo this peace process. Now, in situations where you have elements of resistance, where you have fanatics who oppose, or people who are bitter and people who would like to derail, when they have at their service the resources of a state that can offer money, weapons, training, diplomatic immunity, ideology, a network, everything that Iran has provided, Iran has been brutally effective in being the orchestrator of terror activities inside the Middle East and internationally, and in emanating a very disruptive ideology that is set against the peace process, but also against the stability of this regime. And the Iranian activity and leadership has given a new significance to the elements of opposition that have been built into the picture. Secondly, we have not been able, despite 4 years of very serious negotiations, to come to an agreement with Syria. Now I'm facing two individuals who probably know President Assad and his regime as well as anybody. Secretary has negotiated with him for many hours, and Ambassador Geregian, who was ambassador to Damascus and spent many, many hours with Assad and his men. But I'll venture my own explanation all the same. I think that President Assad is interested in making peace with Israel. And I'm using my word cautiously, interested. Let's say he's not anxious. If he sees an agreement that he likes, an agreement that meets his own definition of a good agreement, he will take it, he will make it. But he will not make any other agreement. It's very difficult to negotiate with somebody who is interested in that way and is not willing to make any other agreement or to make an investment in another agreement. Now, what is an investment? An investment, for instance, to be engaging in public diplomacy. The Syrians told us that they can settle on nothing less than all of the Golan Heights because there's a precedent. The precedent is that of Egypt. President Sadat made peace with Israel and obtained from Prime Minister Begin the whole of the Sinai. So the Syrians like this precedent. So we say, okay, that's what he got, but he also made an investment. You remember, he came to Jerusalem, he spoke to the Knesset, he invited Mr. Begin, he had actually an Israeli military delegation, spent several months in Cairo before there was an agreement. He made an investment in what we today call public diplomacy. Namely, he understood instinctively, as the master politician that he was, that in a democracy like Israel, even if the prime minister wants to deal with you, he needs to have popular or public support, and you need to help him in doing that. That when you move from enmity and rivalry to peacemaking, it ceases to be a zero-sum game, and you become a partner with the other side. You cannot intimate to the other side, we are enemies, and we will continue to remain, and we will remain enemies to the last moment, and of course then we make peace, and then we cease to be enemies. It doesn't work like that. You have to make an investment, you have to take a risk. There is no risk-free peace in all of this. And there's been very little Syrian will to make these investments. Some yes, I cannot say that there wasn't, but very little. Certainly not enough to persuade the Israeli public. And in these last elections, one party called the Third Way ran on a platform of opposition to massive concessions to Syria in the Golan and won 3 seats in our Knesset. And of course, one of the 3 most effective slogans of the victorious party in the elections was, Mr. Peres will get you off the Golan and we will not. So it resonated with the Israeli public. It was a big issue. And the Syrian position of we'll wait until the Israeli side is ready, of course, did not work. So this, of course, is not the only reason as to why there was no deal. And we could spend a long time in doing that, which we don't. But of course, in the discussion period that follows, if you want me to elaborate on any of these aspects, I'd be delighted to do that. But the fact of the matter is that there was no, we have not been able to come to an agreement with Syria. We actually covered quite a bit of ground, and we laid, I think, the foundations for what can become an agreement, but we failed to reach an agreement. This, of course, speculated directly into Lebanon. Lebanon is very much a Syrian protectorate. The Syrians, let me make very clear, do not control Hezbollah. Hezbollah is presumably a Lebanese militia and party. In fact, it is an arm of the Iranian government, and when Hezbollah decides to fire Katyusha rockets into Israel, it does so under instructions from Tehran, not from Damascus. What Syria can do is to stop Hezbollah from doing that, which they have done very sparingly, as part of the same philosophy outlook that I mentioned before, not willing to make too much of an investment. And to the extent that the Syrians have restrained Hezbollah, they did so as much with a view to Washington as with a view to us, because we should always remember, Syria and President Assad are not negotiating solely with Israel, they're also negotiating with the United States. They want to make peace or obtain the Golan from Israel, and they want to have a good relationship with Washington. These are the 2 aims of these negotiations, and it's not a 2-way negotiation, it's a 3-way negotiation. So the failure to make peace with Syria has also meant continued violence in Lebanon, and has also meant the failure to move to a comprehensive peace, because I mentioned the relations that we now have with countries in the Gulf and in North Africa that are less than full-fledged peace. And they have made it very clear. They only wait for one thing, the Israeli-Syrian agreement. When there is an Israeli-Syrian agreement, at least 10 Arab states would be then moved into full recognition of Israel. So a virtual end, to borrow a Washington term, a virtual end to the Arab-Israeli conflict can only come when there is an Israeli-Syrian agreement, and that, of course, has not happened in the 4-year cycle that I have described. And, of course, very painfully, the deep divisions in Israel. The peace process has brought very important gains to Israel, but also exacted a price. Many, unfortunately, fall under the category of victims of peace, which sounds like a terrible abomination, but is a fact of life. There are hundreds of Israelis now who were killed and wounded in terrorist attacks that were somehow, in a very twisted, distorted way, related to the peace process. And many Israelis have come to associate the peace process with terrorism. It's, again, a terrible abomination, but a fact of life. And to put it very crudely, but in a way I think that would reflect the mood of some of the Israeli voters, said, I'm very much moved by the fact that I can now go to Oman, and I'm very much moved by the fact that Israel television can broadcast from Qatar, and the fact that we have telephone links with Morocco is wonderful. But if my wife cannot go safely to the supermarket on the bus, thank you, I'm not interested. That is a mood that, as a result of a very effective, calculated campaign of terrorism, came to persuade many, or to possess many Israelis. There's also another factor that has contributed to this, and this has to do with the nature of the agreement with the Palestinians. As I said earlier, we have a framework agreement with the Palestinians, but we do not have a final status agreement with the Palestinians, and the competition continues. I use the word competition, but sometimes it looks more like a conflict than a competition. I understand intellectually very well that Chairman Arafat needs to keep his people mobilized and needs to galvanize them because his journey, as he sees it, is not over. But we live in a global village, and what you say in Gaza resonates in Tel Aviv. What you say in a speech, you think, to a closed audience, a closed-door audience in South Africa, is replicated in Jerusalem. And when you promise the liberation of Jerusalem, or when you use the language of jihad, which is Islamic holy war, one can say subsequently that jihad doesn't always mean war in the literal sense of the word. It could also mean a spiritual exertion. But again, our mythical voter in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa was not persuaded. This has also been part of the landscape within which the peace process has taken place. And so the Israeli elections took place in May 29. We have said all along that they will be a referendum on a peace process. Now, not purely a referendum on a peace process. We all know that the elections are never voted on one issue, are never decided on one issue. Personalities play an important role. Domestic issues play an important role. 16% of the Israeli electorate are recent immigrants from the former Soviet Union. They were more interested in their own particular issues than in larger national issues. There is a secular religious divide, or secular Orthodox divide in Israel. We also introduced a new electoral system. It was to make our system more presidential. The Prime Minister, this time, people did split their vote, a vote for a party and a vote for the Prime Minister. The idea was to strengthen the position of the Prime Minister, to make him more presidential and to give more stability and more executive power to the system. But it had unintended consequences, because when people could split the vote, they voted what I call a high vote for the Prime Minister and a low vote for our Knesset, the Parliament. Namely, the big questions, the national issues, you decided by voting for the Prime Minister, but when it came to voting for a party, you went for your tribe, your religion, your ethnic group, your region, and the result is a further fragmentation of the Parliament, and a vote that was different than the authors of the reform had in mind. And so, let us remember two things: that the elections were decided on several issues, not just on the issue of the peace process, and secondly, that they were decided by a very small majority. That with better organization, for instance, the Labour Party could have won. 30,000 votes means not that you needed 30,000 votes, means that you needed 16,000 votes in order to have a different result, and that is not all that much. Now, this is not said in order to belittle the significance of the vote. A vote is a vote, and a majority is a majority. We know that. But just for all of us who are tempted to draw far-reaching conclusions for decades to come from the vote of the Israeli public, this is a note of caution. It was a slim majority, and with 20,000 votes going the other way, we would all have been making the opposite argument now. So with a degree of modesty, let us remember that. But in any event, the people of Israel have made a choice. And with regard to the peace process, the choice is this: it is not a rejection of the peace process, but it certainly is a message to the Israeli leadership that reads, go slow. There's been a sense among those, or many of those who voted against the government, that the government was moving too rapidly at neck-breaking speed, and they wanted to see more deliberation, slower pace in the peace process. And of course, some changes in the policy itself. Now, the big question, and of course the third phase that will now open in the peace process, the big question for that phase is, what is the new Israeli government going to do? What are our Arab partners to the peace process going to do? The answer to the first question is not very clear, because the Prime Minister-elect has been very careful. He gave one speech that was formulated in very general terms. You cannot divine a single hint as to what he has in mind. He has authorized very few individuals to speak in his name with authority on national security and foreign policy issues. He has yet to make the major appointments in his cabinet, and the direction is not all that clear. Clearly, not every word used in the rhetoric of the campaign is going to be translated into policy. We all know that you run a campaign one way. You do not, of course, turn around and conduct the opposite policy when in office, but you move somewhat towards a more centrist position when you have the responsibility of government and when you encounter the realities of your own country and the realities of the region and the world once you are the Prime Minister. I think this is very clear to the Prime Minister-elect and to the chief architects of the policies around him. And of course, nothing is determined yet. There'll have to be give and take. There'll have to be a response to the response from the Arab world. Thus far, some of the response has been very positive. King Hussein spoke with a great degree of wisdom and prudence. North Africa has been, and the Gulf have been quiet. There was one disturbing note that came from a meeting in Damascus in which the president of Syria, the president of Egypt, and the Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia participated, and which summoned an Arab summit to meet. It used some rough language, including a threat of violence in the event that the peace process does not continue according to that definition. This is not a good message. In this transitional period, when decisions are made and when things have not gelled yet, I would caution my Arab colleagues and friends to be careful with their own rhetoric, and I know the administration and many other governments around the world do that on the eve of the Arab summit, trying to tell the participants in the summit that they shouldn't close any doors, they should give credit, they should not pose any preconditions, and let the process, or give the new Prime Minister and the process credit, and work together in order to make it successful. Now, a very important step in the formulation of the policies will be Prime Minister Netanyahu's first visit as Prime Minister to the United States. Now, the news broke out today that the visit that could conceivably have taken place on the 25th of June will now take place only after the 4th of July weekend. I had the task of dealing with the administration over that issue, and let me tell you precisely what it was. First of all, there still isn't a government in place. It's very likely that there will be a government on the 17th of June when the Knesset meets for its first meeting, but it's not a certainty. And I don't think the Prime Minister-elect wants to maneuver himself into a precious situation where he needs to put the government in place because he has a certain date in Washington on June the 25th. Secondly, even if the government is formed on the 17th, he wants to prepare himself thoroughly for the visit. He doesn't want to be in a position where in negotiations, discussions with the Secretary of State and the President, points would come up that would not have been thought through in Jerusalem before embarking on the journey. And so I told the Secretary of State that the Prime Minister-elect wishes to come later and better prepared, and it was graciously accepted, and we now are looking for a mutually convenient date in July. So please don't look for any drama in the decision. I was asked by the press earlier about a cancellation. It's not a cancellation, it's a postponement, mutually agreed, and I think for good reasons. Finally, perhaps a personal word. My wife and I will not be staying very long in Washington. I'm not a career diplomat. I was appointed, as I told you earlier, by Prime Minister Rabin. I represented his government and his policies. It's a new government. The policies will be somewhat different. I think it would be the right thing for me to go back to Israel. I spoke about it to the Prime Minister-elect, and we perfectly understood each other. And we agree that I will do the necessary transition. It could be a matter of several weeks. I'll certainly deal with his first visit to the United States. And in larger way, Israel is now going through the third full-fledged change of power since 1977. We have 3 full-fledged changes of power. Power shifted successfully from one side to the other 3 times now, and I think this is going to be the pace of Israeli political life from now on. Every few years the government will change, and we will just behave like a normal democratic state. So with this upbeat note, let me conclude this presentation and tell you that I'm at your disposal for any question or comment. Please feel free to ask the most embarrassing and the most difficult of questions. I'll take any of them. Thank you very much. Yes, sir, I think yes.
I'm appalled at the amount of weapons and explosives that seem to flow into the Palestinians. Do the Israelis try to keep them from getting that stuff?
Sir, I spoke earlier about the mental transition that you need to go when you make peace with a former enemy, and this is one of these transitions. There is a Palestinian so-called police, which is more a militia than a police, that has been formed as part of the agreement with our agreement and encouragement, because we are interested in the Palestinians having an orderly, stable administration. Now, there are many evil wishers and evildoers, mostly the fundamentalist terrorists, and for Yasser Arafat to govern and administer effectively and to participate with us in providing security for us, he needs to have not just a political clout, but also the physical force for doing that. So as long as we are talking about weapons that go to the Palestinian police, that is fine with us. There is another problem, though, namely the problem of illegal weapons, and the fact that he tolerated these caches of weapons and explosives until the last waves of bombings, suicide bombings in February and March. He then understood the magnitude of the challenge, not just to us, but also to himself, and began to crack down on them. Prime Minister Rabin, I remember many, many times, said to Arafat, you must understand, for a government to be effective and legitimate, there can only be one line of authority in a body politic. And there can only be one authority and one source for authorizing weapons. And if you allow the mushrooming of paramilitary groups or terrorist groups that have weapons and explosives, this will be the end of you. So this, of course, is a distinction that we have to bear in mind. Françoise, please.
Yes, I could ask you, you spoke a bit about the new hopes in the economic sector into Israel and several of its Arab partners. And how much do you think this will influence the new government?
Okay. Somehow I have a feeling that in the last rows you have not heard the question, right? Yeah. Mrs. Derigian was facing me and speaking in a soft voice, so let me recapitulate her question. It was a question, of course, about the economic hopes that come with peace, and how or to what extent these hopes or expectations are likely to shape the policies of the incoming Israeli government. Let me say the following. We don't have great expectations of boom as a result of trade or direct economic relations with our neighbors. The volume of our economies is different. That's our immediate neighbors. The volumes of our economies are quite different. They are not complementary. And trade between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Syria are not going to be major sources of economic prosperity for Israel, or for that matter, to our neighbors. This is not where our hopes for economic prosperity lie. When we look at the economic prosperity for ourselves and for the Middle East, we look at other things. First of all, we look at stability. And the region has suffered from wars and instability. And the prospect of peace and stability has already brought a lot of money to the region and to Israel. Major investments were made in Israel by Intel, Mercedes, VW, Motorola. They all made huge investments in the past few years. The major investment banks from New York now have offices in Israel. We have trade with India and with China that we never had before. Israel is doing very well economically as an indirect result of peace, not as a result of trade with our Arab neighbors. That is one aspect. Second is that there is an urgent need for regional economic projects, or economic or infrastructure. For instance, the problem of water. The problem of water cannot be resolved except on a regional basis. There's water in Turkey. Turkey would love to sell water and make money on the water, and we and the Jordanians and the Saudis would love to buy the water. Only one problem: the pipeline needs to cross Syrian territory. So you need to have political peace with Syria before you can have that. But you need to think about both at the same time. This was the whole idea of the multilateral peace talks, that you talk about development when you negotiate the political issues, so that you have a vision of what benefits lie at the end of the line. And water is just one of the regional development issues that we ought to look at. Thirdly, we can have very beneficial relations with Middle Eastern countries that are not our immediate neighbors. Qatar, for instance, mentioned before, has lots of gas. One way of sending the gas could be to lay a pipeline that would cross Israeli territory, something that economic terms makes ample sense for the Qataris and for us, but would require stable peace in order for that to happen. So this is where the expectations lie. Now, fourthly, there is a conviction on our part. This is Mr. Peres's economic vision of peace that has so often been misunderstood, and I'd like to explain exactly what it is. Mr. Peres is a very hard-nosed political leader. Is a former defense minister, a former director general of the Ministry of Defense. He's the father of the Israeli nuclear program. See, this is something I would say at the Baker Institute and not at the Carter Institute. So he knows all about security. And when he speaks about the economic vision of peace, he doesn't become soft-minded about it. But he says, if we want people in Egypt, in Jordan, other places to have a stake in peace, or Palestinians in Gaza, you need to give them some economic well-being. You need to give them housing. You need to give them jobs. Since it won't happen in and of itself, Israel wants to participate in that. And Israel is willing to be a catalyst. This has been misinterpreted twice. Once by people who thought that this replaces hard-nosed security approach, and a second by some people in the Arab world who said, "Ha-ha, this is neocolonialism. What they really want is to dominate us." And therefore, we have moderated the rhetoric of the economics of peace, because we understood that the receiving end is not yet ready for this kind of language. So it's an area that is full of promise, but also full of problems. Yes, please.
Prime Minister Netanyahu said that he wanted to push more settlements into the West Bank. Wouldn't this be an explosive issue?
He didn't say that.
He said that in his campaign.
Well, as I said earlier, not every word that was said in the campaign will become a policy. Now, the settlements issue is a potentially explosive issue. I think everybody knows that, but not a word has been said since the election. So, let us on this issue. Let us wait. But you will notice that since the election day to date, the Prime Minister-elect has not said a word on this issue. Yes, please.
Aside from what might be its capital city and how Gaza and the West Bank might be connected, what are the pros and cons of an independent Palestinian state?
Well, a Palestinian state is what the Palestinians want. There's no denying that. This is what they want. This is the stated goal of the Palestinians. Now, Palestinian state, as you said, first of all, has no territorial contiguity. And if you ask Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis, it's not great to have a state without territorial contiguity. It tends to break. Second, a Palestinian state in itself is not going to solve the Palestinian problem, in the sense that, Gaza is overpopulated many times. The West Bank is a very small area. You cannot have all the Palestinians come and live there. And you have a Palestinian majority in Jordan. You have Israeli Arabs who are ethnically Palestinians. And the idea of having a state, maybe with irredentist claims, or certain maybe with the prospect of destabilizing at least Jordan, could be destabilizing for the region. Thirdly, frankly, a state means full control of your foreign and national security policies. I don't think the degree of mutual trust between Israelis and Palestinians is such that at this point, the majority of Israelis would feel that it's something they can have. Finally, let me say that the notion of state has undergone many changes. If you look at the almost 200 states that you have now in the world, they're very different. Some of the former states of the Soviet Union, Belarus is a state, it's a member of the United Nations, but is Belarus really a durable state? And likewise, if you look around the globe at some of the other former states or members of or parts of the Soviet Union and other states, they are not full-fledged states in the sense that many other states are. So I think when we negotiate, and we have 3 years for that, final status issues, I think we ought to be very creative in thinking about what terms like state, sovereignty really mean, and the solution may be somewhat simpler than it seems to us right now. Yes, please.
It seems to be a transition of power in Saudi Arabia, and I'm wondering what you thought of the impact of that transition on the entire peace process.
Well, clearly, King Fahd is not well. The reason that the Damascus meeting took place in Damascus was that he could not be the host in Saudi Arabia, and therefore it had to be shifted to Damascus. And he, of course, didn't go there, but was represented by Prince Abdullah. So sooner or later, there will be a transition of power in Saudi Arabia. It need not have an impact on the peace process altogether. Of course, Saudi Arabia is a very important state in the region, not just because of its resources, but because of the moral position of the House of Saud and its impact. The fact it dominates the smaller Arab states of the Gulf and has a great deal of influence on Syria, on the Palestinians, in many other ways. And if Saudi Arabia has a cold, most Arabs would sneeze. But there is stability. I think that the heir apparent is quite clear. There's no reason that there would not be a smooth transition of power, and there's no reason for any impact either on the peace process or on other regional issues as a result of this anticipated change. I think, yes, sir, over there.
We hear conflicting reports of whether the objectionable language, the PLO covenant, has that actually been taken out of the covenant? Has that been acted upon?
Well, the short and the long answer is yes. Now there is, I spoke earlier about the sometimes dual or ambiguous message that Chairman Arafat sends, because he, as I said earlier, he still wants to keep his constituency together. Now, he did the right thing. The Palestine National Council met and passed a resolution that expunged the articles under question from the covenant. So that was done. What he has also done, though, is he indicated that they'll now have to write a new covenant, and he didn't say what the new covenant would be. So he created some point of ambiguity, and this was, by the way, a big issue in the Israeli elections, because the then opposition, now the incoming government, made huge political capital on this ambiguity. So my answer is yes, he changed it. It's still surrounded by ambiguity. And I think one of the changes that you are likely to see while on settlements, there's some very difficult decisions need to be taken by the new government. On the covenant, I think it will be very easy for them to say, we just want a very loud and clear statement from you. That is relatively an easy issue.
I think what we've heard tonight proves that Ambassador Rabinovich lives up to his outstanding reputation as being truly a man who has dedicated himself to making peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors and has made a major contribution, and we are truly honored to have had him tonight. I would like to ask Mrs. Rabinovich to come up, and part of our tradition to accept this small token from the Baker Institute, and to thank you both very much for coming. What I understand was a rather rocky ride on the airplane from Washington, but many, many thanks for being with us. We're very proud to have you here. Thank you.